Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this breakfast seminar on the changes to governance in not-for-profits in Australia. I'm Vera Visevic, and I head up the not-for-profit and charity team here in Sydney. And I thank you all for joining me. I've got people here in front of me looking very alert and interested, so thank you for coming in. And also people obviously online who are also tuning in this morning. I'm going to go through a fairly lengthy PowerPoint presentation, but be assured, those of you who are watching online, that I will send you a copy of this and also some other materials that we've prepared for this morning. Because this is being broadcast online as well, with any questions that you have, feel free to type them in. For those of you here in the room, if you could save them to the end, we'll have some time at the end to deal with your questions. So thank you for that. So let's get started because there's a lot to cover this morning. So you'll see up on the screen there are a number of different areas that I want to cover. And I wanted to explain that the genesis of this presentation is my own experience in terms of what I'm seeing happening in governance in not-for-profits. And this is through obviously working with not-for-profits, but also seeing how the courts are dealing with different issues arising from governance in not-for-profits and charities, and also reading what some of the experts are saying. So I'm seeing, at least over the last few years, there's some trends emerging, and they are strong enough, I think, that they warrant actually being explored. And what I'm hoping to put to you this morning is what these trends are and where I see them going. And I really want to encourage the not-for-profit sector in Australia to be on the front foot and to be alert to what these trends are so they can actually start preparing, and so that they are comfortable that they're complying with their governance requirements rather than being caught out and then having to deal with the aftermath of not having implemented proper frameworks. So as you go through with the presentation with me this morning, you'll see what these trends are, and hopefully I'll be able to give you some practical tips that you can implement if you think that they're relevant to your particular organisation. So in terms of what the most recent events have been that have led to some of these changes, obviously all of the Royal Commissions, we've had 4 now. So we've had child abuse, we've had the Banking Commission, we've had aged care, and we're in the early stages of the Disability Royal Commission. So the reports that are coming out from those Royal Commissions have a very heavy focus on governance. And in actual fact, the Aged Care Royal Commission, which issued its final report a few weeks ago, if you read through the 150 recommendations that the Commission has put forward, close to a half deal with governance. If you look at the Banking Royal Commission, many of those deal with governance. And so this is where I'm seeing some of the trends happening. There have been some high-profile cases in the not-for-profit sector in Australia where people have been engaging in behaviour that's not ideal. And obviously when that hits the front page of the paper, that can be quite embarrassing. So we've seen some issues in governance which have led to those embarrassing situations, and also just seeing what society is expecting of us as not-for-profits, what they are requiring of us in terms of how we're running our organisations, the decisions that we're making. I'm seeing society be a little bit more vocal in terms of what it thinks that we should be doing, and so it's important to also take that into account. So those particular events, in my opinion, have led to a number of changes. One is the increasing importance in culture in a not-for-profit organisation. There was a very good report that came out, I don't know whether it was this week or last week, from AICD, which has done a fairly thorough review of culture in organisations in Australia. And although they don't distinguish too much between for-profits and not-for-profits, many of the lessons there I think are relevant to not-for-profits. In the last few years, I've seen this perspective grow in prominence, which is the customer-centricity perspective. Sometimes you heard it called the stakeholder-centricity perspective. So we'll look at that. I'm also seeing that authorities and regulators are expecting us as not-for-profits to be much more aware of what our other stakeholders are requiring of us. And these are stakeholders outside the organisation itself. We have cybersecurity emerging as a fairly big issue that's affecting not-for-profits, and also climate change. So I'm going to look at all of those this morning and show you some common threads going throughout, which will hopefully help us improve on our governance. In trying to get my head around all these different events and what they're sort of telling us, I found that the underlying foundation to all of this is strategy. If a board is proficient at strategizing, in making long-term plans, in being aware of what's happening both inside and outside the organisation, then it's almost a given that their governance will be robust, the decisions they make will be good decisions, and it's less likely that there'll be any sort of negative fallout such as abuse situations, complaints, litigation, and the like. So as I'm going through this morning, you'll see that at every turn, I'm going to be talking about strategy and how boards should be thinking about, can we strategize better to be prepared, to be aware, and to be making decisions now which will serve us well in the future. I'm seeing as well that strategy is no longer just something that we expect boards to do. In my opinion, it's almost becoming a quasi-legal duty, and I'll show you that this morning. So when you read some of what the commissioners are saying in these royal commissions, and even what some court cases are saying, there's this underlying theme where they're basically expecting us as not-for-profits to think longer term and to have a very good strategy process and implementation in place. So strategy is no longer it'd be nice if we did it. Strategy, I think, now is becoming almost a legal requirement where we can no longer run away from strategy. We really need to have that embedded in the way that our board operates. So in my opinion, strategy is central to the decisions that the board makes, to how we consider all of our various stakeholders. And if we do strategy well at a board level and then have that implemented throughout the organisation, it's more likely than not that directors will be fulfilling their duties. And if they fulfil their duties, it's less likely that there'll be some sort of reputational financial risk to the organisation. So let's move on to what is strategy. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this. We've all heard about strategy. Apparently there are 80-something definitions of strategy out there. There's no statutory definition. It really is a matter of choosing a definition that suits your organisation. I've got a couple there on the screen. I've got a very simple one to begin with and a more complex definition. I think the second one is a little bit better from the first because it does talk about both the internal and external dynamics of the organisation. So what you'll see this morning is boards can no longer just focus on what's happening within the organisation. They need to start broadening their horizon and thinking about external events, issues, forces, stakeholders, so that their decisions encompass all of those people. Why are directors reluctant to engage in strategy? And they're just some of the more common reasons, and these are reasons that I see when I'm working with not-for-profits, where directors don't really understand what it means, they don't have the time, they don't feel confident in thinking beyond the operational, and sometimes it's a function of the actual size of the not-for-profit. If it's a very small not-for-profit or charity and there aren't the resources at a management level to be carrying out the activities of the not-for-profit, often the board itself will be engaged in doing some of those operations because there's just no one else to do it. So that in itself can sometimes tempt the board into just the operational sphere and not actually focus on the strategic. I've sat on more boards than I can count, and I have had a number of experiences where at board meetings there's been almost a level of frustration amongst the directors, being those who understand the need for strategy, because the actual agenda of the meeting, the CEO, the way that the chair leads the meeting almost requires the board to dig their hands into the operational, and then before you know it, the 2 hours are up and there's no time to think beyond that and go into strategy. So one meeting I sat at, we spent half an hour talking about whether we should send something in the post or by email. You know, a purely operational matter. We shouldn't have wasted our time, but at that moment it seemed so important to everyone, and it meant that then the meeting was over. We never actually got onto anything of any importance. or I've been at, you know, in other law firms, partners meetings where we spend half an hour talking about whether we should have cookies in the kitchen, right? And so if you're having 10 partners sitting around a room at, I don't know, whatever hourly rate, complete waste of time and money. And again, it's a comfortable thing to be talking about operations. It's a little bit more uncomfortable and challenging to actually say, gosh, you know, where are we going to be in 10 years' time? What's happening out there in the world? Are we prepared? Are we making some really hard decisions so that whatever does happen, we'll be able to deal with that? Part of the problem of not strategizing and focusing on the operational is that directors will inevitably think shorter term. So they'll be thinking about this year, the next year. They won't actually be thinking what is going to be best for the organisation longer term. And that will then mean longer term that it's going to affect their sustainability and effectiveness in terms of delivering their mission. And this really came out in the Royal Commissions, where it was evident in the banking industry, aged care in particular, that boards were unnecessarily preoccupied with short-term financial metrics to the point where they weren't actually investing time and money into what do we need to do longer term to make sure that we will be actually looking after our residents in a way that's actually appropriate. So by thinking short-term financial metrics, let's not spend too much money, let's not spend too much time, let's not think about where we're going to be in 5 years' time if we're trying to scrimp and save and increase our bottom line at the cost of actually delivering the services that our residents need. And that was actually quite a prominent theme throughout that Royal Commission. And funnily enough, when I think of strategy, I think of the concept of wisdom, which I think is making a decision now that you'll be happy with later on. So even if we just think about wisdom or strategy being wise, I think that in itself will encourage directors to think, I'm making a decision now, this may work for us now. Are there any potential consequences in 2, 3, 4 years' time that will actually mean that this decision wasn't as good as we thought it was? There was a recent study done by an accounting firm into not-for-profits and strategy earlier this year, and the study showed only 55% of not-for-profits reviewed their strategy in the last 6 months, which is about half. So not all that encouraging. In doing the study, it came out that certain sectors of the not-for-profit world in Australia struggle in particular. So, for example, disability service providers with NDIS. NDIS, from what I'm being told, is really decreasing the profit margins of the services to the point that it's almost becoming financially unfeasible to provide these services. And so boards of disability service providers are so caught up in how do we financially make this work that they don't have the time to think beyond that and start thinking about longer term strategic plans and the like. And yet it's almost a catch-22 in that if they don't think longer term, that's going to add to their problems and will probably make it even less likely they're going to be sustainable longer term. We even had some cases going back to 1992, which is what, 30 years ago, where we start seeing hints of a duty of directors to actually prepare and implement strategy. So it's not something that's new, but it's not very overt. And this is where I'm seeing in recent times, even regulators are coming out saying, boards, you need to be strategic. You can't run away from it. We actually do see it as part of your director's duties. And I'm going to explore that in more detail later in the morning. With the Royal Commissions, they started talking about strategy being a legal duty, and they said in particular 2 directors' duties will or should encompass strategy, and they are the duty to act in the best interests of the organisation and the duty of care and diligence. So here we see in the Banking Royal Commission, Commissioner Hayne said that directors do have need to have a long-term perspective. Whenever you see the phrase long-term, that equates to strategy. So directors should have a long-term perspective on how their activities will affect all of the stakeholders. So again, we're seeing a broadening of that. It's not just stakeholders within the organisation, such as if you're a member-based organisation, your members or your clients or the families you're serving or your employees. Commissioner Hayne is saying we have to look at all of the stakeholders, which actually includes people outside the organisation. And if an organisation fails to consider all of these stakeholders, this will then, as seen in the Royal Commissions, result in mistreatment of people, which then leads to damage, reputational damage, financial damage, which we saw come out in the Royal Commissions, and that then potentially could lead to personal liability for directors. We're also seeing that the duty of care and diligence is being broadened as a duty, and that is now, one could argue, encompassing the need to deal with cybersecurity at a board level and also climate change. So again, I'm going to go into more detail later on, but the thought is that because technology is such a critical part of our infrastructure of any organisation, the need to ensure that that works well and that serves the organisation well is becoming an element of the director's duty to act with care and diligence. And with regard to climate change, we know from everything that we read and see that the community and some regulators are now expecting directors to consider climate change when making decisions. So it's not something, again, that's on the periphery of board decision making. It's not something that may come up every once in a while. These authorities are saying that directors need to understand that as part of fulfilling their duties, they need to now start thinking about climate change. And that includes having, again, long-term strategies for mitigating the risk arising from climate change and also managing those risks. It's interesting to see what other Commonwealth countries are doing, and I found this in the Companies Act of the UK, which has been around since 2006. And this is their definition of a duty of good faith, which is a duty that applies to directors, the breach of which could lead to personal liability. And you'll see that in their definition, they talk about employees, suppliers, customers, other people, the community, environment. So their actual definition of good faith now includes all of these different people and all of these different issues. So I think in the not too distant future, I wouldn't be surprised if the Australian law had something similar, because there's so much discussion now at a fairly high level about the need for boards to actually think about all these other people and all these other issues happening in the community. Looking at all of this, this is a model that I came up with to try to capture the change that I'm seeing in governance in not-for-profits. And you'll see at the centre we have the board, and that the board has this requirement to strategise. And I've tried to map out all the different stakeholders and all the different issues that I see now coming within the ambit of governance. So if we start off within the organisation, we have culture and we have those people we serve as a not-for-profit. If you move beyond the organisation, you've got other stakeholders, and I'll define who they are when I get to that, and also issues such as climate change and cybersecurity. So I think that the scope of the governance framework for a not-for-profit will need to start encompassing all these different people and all these different events. I'm not saying that every single not-for-profit is going to have the same governance framework or the same level of risk with regard to these different elements, but it is something that I think a board should at least every once in a while sit down and talk about. Do we need to be thinking about climate change? How does that impact on our organisation? How does that impact on our clients or customers or members? And at least make a decision about, does something need to change? Right, so at least it's on the board's radar as an issue that needs to be discussed, and then appropriate changes to the framework can happen. And I think what I was hoping to show in the diagram is that if you make poor decisions internally, there's almost a ripple effect of the consequences it can have then moving out beyond the organisation. So all of these different circles are linked, and making a decision that only considers one element can have a disastrous consequence for another element if we haven't actually thought about it properly. Let's start going through these different elements and see how does strategy play a role in that, and what sort of practical steps can a board and management take to at least have a proper discussion about it and then make decisions about whether something needs to change within the organisation. So I'm going to start off with the organisational culture, which is, I think, the very core of any organisation. Now, similar to strategy, there's no single definition, obviously. Everyone's got their own definition of culture. I thought the Asset Commissioner had a fairly good definition. It's the underlying mindset of an organisation. It shapes and influences people's attitudes and behaviours towards customers and compliance. So I don't need to tell you, because you would have seen it, especially the Royal Commissions, one of the big themes was poor culture. And they drew a direct link between the poor culture within a not-for-profit or the banking industry and the consequential bad behaviour, which actually led to the need for a Royal Commission. Now, some of the symptoms of poor culture will include poor accountability, failure to consider non-financial risks and the like, and this then, over time, grew into poor culture, which affected the entire organisation. You would have heard of the RSL case, which was the subject of its own inquiry. And this is where the New South Wales President spent $500,000 of the organisation's money on his own personal expenses. And the inquiry concluded that the culture of the organisation let him get away with it. And some of the cultural failings were lack of rigour in keeping adequate financial systems and records, failure to refresh the people on the board. They're the same people on the board for a very long time. That in itself will lead to poor culture within the organisation, same auditor, same advisors. There was no change. There was no agent of change to come in and actually say, what on earth are you doing? This is wrong. So that in itself, I think, added to the situation. And then there was poor culture throughout the whole organisation where people further down the food chain could see what was happening at a board level, but never felt comfortable questioning it or just went with the flow and thought, well, this is how it is. And so we're just going to ignore what's going on and let these people get away with it. I think that if the board had been more strategic about the way it actually ran the organisation, they would have thought about issues such as if we have poor financial systems, if we have no change in board composition, with the same directors in there year after year after year, if we have no consideration at all about stakeholders inside and outside the organisation, all those things will lead to poor culture, which then just almost creates a snowballing effect where the poor culture then allows this behaviour to continue and just sort of grows worse and worse. One thing I have seen, which I think is critical to any not-for-profit having a good governance framework, is the need to have change at board level. I was on a board once where one of the directors had been there for 35 years. And that was okay, right? Because we valued his skills, because it was a fairly unique service that this charity was offering, and we valued his historical knowledge and his understanding of the issues, and so everyone was quite happy for this gentleman to be on the board for 35 years. The problem, however, was that even for those of us who were new to the board, if we wanted to bring up a new idea, a new initiative, explore something, we'd immediately be cut down because this gentleman would say, try that in 1986, didn't work, let's move on, that's just a waste of our time, right? So something as simple as having fresh blood on the board can be a very good way of actually improving culture, because if people within the organisation see that things aren't as they should be, I have to say it does give them some hope to know we've got elections coming up and hopefully some of these obstinate directors will leave or be replaced, or even if we just get new people onto the board, there's some hope that they're going to see that things need to improve, and so it'll be an opportunity for us to start changing the behavioural systems within the organisation. Studies have shown that if an organisation actually has good culture, this has a number of positive effects on the organisation, such as employees being more satisfied, performing better, having better human relations between everyone, and even increasing the profitability of the organisation. So some 20 to 30% of what it takes to be profitable comes out of the culture of the organisation. So I think these positive consequences should be enough of an impetus for us to actually start thinking about, do we need to change our culture? So what can we do to improve culture at a board level? How can we strategize to improve the culture? And we're going to look at three things: defining culture, board composition, which I've mentioned, and what the board can do practically to make that happen. So the first thing is to actually define culture, and this is, I'm going to tell you things you already know, but studies have shown that if the board with management can sit down and actually define what their particular cultural ideal is, so it's got to be something bespoke to them. There's no one-size-fits-all model. So trying to come up with the culture that that organisation itself wants to have, and then drafting into a simple, short document that is then shared with everyone in the organisation, and the organisation can see that the board is committed to actually implementing that. So it's not just talking the talk, it's walking the talk, right? And when employees see that the board is quite committed to, at a very practical level, implementing changes in the culture, they will then buy into that, and that'll make it more effective. To quote Catherine Livingstone, who's the chair of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, she said, keep behaviours to a few vital markers. So make it simple. Don't have a very lengthy document going on page after page after page as to what we require of you. She said half a dozen behaviours that boards can model, so the board has to live it itself, and the message will get through the rest of the organisation very quickly. And obviously, there'll be some common elements in every organisation's culture about integrity, about respect. These should form part of any definition of culture, but then the organisation can go beyond that to define something that's specific for itself. In terms of, governance itself, board composition, which I mentioned to you, that is critical. So in order to have a good culture within the organisation, studies have shown having a diverse board can have a huge impact. Having different people from different backgrounds with different skill sets, different experiences, different knowledge will mean that the discussion at the board level is much more robust. People that can actually challenge each other, and they can actually tease out the thought going into making a decision, which will inevitably mean that the decision making is better. And also, they say that directors should have the right values themselves. And you'll see there on the screen, if the board doesn't walk the talk, management will pick up on it very quickly and will permeate throughout the entire organisation. So that behaviour should, we all know this, should start at a board level. The Aged Care Royal Commission, I told you the report came out a few weeks ago, had a number of recommendations, as I said, about governance. One of them is that the directors of an aged care facility should be fit and proper people. So this is actually coming out as a requirement. This requires consideration of the director's honesty, knowledge and ability, and also an analysis of the person's good character and reputation. They need to act with integrity and exercise sound judgment. Now, my challenge or my question there is, how do you measure whether someone's a fit person? How do you know if they're honest? How do you know if they act with integrity? And I think that's going to be the hard part, especially not-for-profits that don't really have a great pool of people to choose their directors from. How do you have any sense of certainty that the people who are being nominated onto your board actually come with that background of integrity, respect, good values, etc.? So that's something that I think needs to be explored a little bit better. Because everyone will tell you that they're honest and they're respectful. It's only when you've been on the board with them for 3 years that you realise that, in actual fact, they're not. What can the board do at a practical level to make sure that culture is taken seriously? One is to actually have it as a board agenda item. So the chair of Lend-Lease and the director of Woolworths said, it is the board's role to make sure culture is on the agenda and gets enough meaningful airtime at board meetings. This demonstrates to management and the organisation it has to be taken very seriously. And I have to say, honestly, hand on heart, with all the boards I sit on, we do not have culture on our board agenda. And having now studied this, I think we're going to have to change that. It doesn't have to be there at every single board meeting, but I would have thought at least a couple of times a year there needs to be some fairly decent discussion amongst the directors about the culture. Is it what we want it to be? Does anything need to change? So, what can we do? You can have some fairly formal oversight practices at a board level. You can have independent reviews. This is where you pay a consultant to come in and do a review of the organisation and tell you independently what the culture is like. You can have policies that you create which everyone in the organisation has to comply with in terms of improving culture. Having meetings with employees, getting them into a room and saying, tell me what you think about the culture, what can be improved. Having a subcommittee of the board that focuses on ethics, conduct, and culture. Doing surveys to collect, complaints and feedback. Having a dedicated email address or phone number where people know that if they write in or they call with an issue or complaint, that it's going to a person that you can actually do something about it. And to add to the list, and this is what I'm seeing myself with not-for-profits, I'm seeing more and more not-for-profits and charities saying, Vera, we want a code of conduct. We want a code of conduct for our board. We want a code of, if we're member-based, we want a code of conduct for our members and even for our employees. And when directors join the board, they're going to sign up to say, I, Vera Visevic, agree to abide by this code. I'm going to treat people with respect. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. So it's front and center, and there's no excuse, well, I didn't know, or I didn't realise that was such a high priority for your particular organisation. I'm even noticing these days when you're calling up government departments. I was calling up Centrelink the other day, and they have this message recorded just before they put you through. You've been on the phone for half an hour waiting for someone to actually talk to you, and you're about to talk to someone because then they'll replay this message, which will say, we expect you to talk to all our people with respect, and if you fail to do so, we reserve the right to hang up. So I'm even seeing in society, there's this greater reliance on respect. We need to respect each other. And I think, let's be very front and centre about it. Let's talk to our directors about it. Let's talk to management about it. This is something that we require of you. It's not negotiable. It's in our code of conduct, or it's in our policies. And let's measure how we're actually complying with that. In terms of informal oversight practices, this is where, on an informal basis, directors will actually go for a walk around the organisation and talk to employees and say, what do you think? Have you got any issues? And really sort of have a first-hand experience of what the culture is like. To read that quote there from Elizabeth Alexander, if you just attend board meetings and hear presentations, you won't understand the culture. The more you can hear on the shop floor about what's happening and interface with people, the better understanding of culture you will have. So this is where, and again, with all the boards I've sat on, we haven't really done it well enough, where you just take the time to attend functions with employees, or even on an ad hoc basis after a board meeting, just go out and start talking to people. I remember with one organisation I was involved in, one of the directors did that, and the chair quickly came up and said, what on earth are you doing talking to the staff? You're not allowed to talk to the staff. If you want to talk to the staff, you have to go through me, the chair. And that was a sign that things weren't as they should be, which I discovered fairly soon after that. So what else can the board do at a practical level? Keep some metrics about complaints, absenteeism, staff turnover. Even within Mills Oakley, as a partner, I'll get told, these are the staff turnover rates. This is how the rates this month compare with the rates in April last year. We have done our analysis, and this is why the turnover rate is what it is, and we've talked to people and done exit interviews and found out what the issues are. So even just keeping those sorts of records will, I think, convey to the board what the issue, especially if you're seeing the same theme over and over again, it means that the board then really has to do something about it. This is a case study about culture, and I found it interesting because of the questions that the board asked itself when it was trying to assess what the culture was like within that particular organisation. So this particular organisation was accused of abusing human rights, and when the board had to actually tackle that, they found that they didn't even really know how to measure what the culture was. How do we know if the abuse of human rights is happening within our organisation? How do we actually identify that? And so they thought to themselves, let's imagine the board writing, say we're going to list ourselves on the stock market. Let's imagine the board writing a statement describing our good culture and describing how we know we've got a good culture. And that whole exercise led them to look at their policies, their processes, their training, etc. And it took them a good 18 months to go and analyse all of this within the organisation. And after 18 months, they could then finally say, having looked at all this, having changed our policies, our procedures, our training, etc., we can now honestly say that we do have a good culture and we do not have any human rights abuse, incidents happening in the organisation. So that whole exercise was new for them, but it caused them to start asking the right questions, which I think was helpful. So moving on to customer centricity. Now, you can call it customer centricity, you can call it stakeholder centricity, there are a number of different ways of describing it. But when I talk about customers, I'm talking about your clients, I'm talking about the families you serve, I'm talking about your members, and so on. And customer centricity really means, instead of just assuming we know what these people need or want, we need to somehow flip it around. So actually in their shoes, trying to identify what their particular needs are, and then trying to come up with a solution that addresses those needs, but also then can work for the organisation. There's no point in coming up with measures or new activities that is actually detrimental to the organisation. So it's trying to find that middle ground, but in a way that truly does look at what these customers are telling you they need from you. And this is something that in particular came out in the Royal Commissions. The fact that the children, obviously in the Child Sexual Abuse Royal Commission, the elderly in the Aged Care Royal Commission, people with disability in the current Royal Commission, customers, all of those people, their genuine needs were ignored to a large extent. And if the organisations actually bothered talking to these people and trying to genuinely listen to them and trying to identify what they needed, then these Royal Commissions wouldn't have even, I think, existed. So all of the Royal Commissions spoke about the need to be child-centric, customer-centric, resident-centric, to the point where they've started recommending new duties. And the Aged Care Royal Commission in its recent report said that there should be a positive and non-delegable. Non-delegable means the board can't say, we're going to pass it on to management and they're going to take responsibility for that. It's got to be something that rests with the board. Management can help, the responsibility lies with the board. So a positive and non-delegable duty to ensure that care that is provided is high quality and reasonable. And the Banking Royal Commission said the duty of good faith includes considering the interests of customers. Commissioner Haynes said that this signalled a shift away from shareholder primacy, so obviously financial interest, and a short-termism perspective to a customer-centric long-term outlook. And again, when you see long-term, that's strategy, right? So the Aged Care Royal Commission and the Banking Royal Commission are actually saying what we have seen occur in these sectors, it is so seriously bad that we now need to start thinking about increasing or expanding the duties that are placed on directors. And when you see duties placed on directors, that inevitably means a breach of that could lead to personal liability, right? So these Royal Commissions are saying the buck stops with the board. And if you don't take this seriously enough about looking after your residents, the people you're serving, your customers, etc., then we may actually hold you personally liable for the outcome, which is quite frightening, I think, and very serious. Now, how can we as an organisation be more customer centric? The first place you can start is looking at the objects clause in your constitution, because the objects clause really drives what a not-for-profit or a charity does. And it's quite an interesting exercise to look at your objects clause and see how customer centric is the actual objects clause. Does it adequately identify the people we're trying to help? Does it actually show how we're going to help these people? And does it actually involve our customers, our clients, our members in the fulfillment of those objects and actually trying to get feedback off them? So as an example, the Breast Cancer Network Australia organisation, they were highlighted in an innovation study of not-for-profits in Australia back in 2017 as being innovative. And the main reason they were innovative was because they were so proficient at being customer centric. And it all started with their objects clause. And you'll see in their objects clause, it talks about who they're going to help. So that's people personally affected by breast cancer. So not just the people with the cancer, but the families and friends who are affected as well. How they're going to help these people by providing a wide range of resources, and how we're actually going to involve these people in our activities and our objects. And it says there to play an act, so it's going to actually invite these people to play an active role in improving the treatment and the services and facilitate and assist support groups. So this charity was fantastic, not only in saying, okay, who are we here to help? It's not just people suffering from breast cancer, it's their extended family, their extended networks. Let's try to help all of them. Let's get them in. Let's talk to them about what they need from us. Let's then try to deliver on that. And let's actually ask them to give us feedback on how we're actually performing. Ask them to give you some sort of commentary or critique about whether you're actually satisfying or meeting the needs that they have, and asking them for ideas about how to improve. So there's that customer centricity. And the study showed that this particular charity, because of how customer centric it was, not just with the object scores, they actually brought in the whole architecture of the organisation. So they changed the policies, the procedures and the like. They actually showed that by being customer centric, their income increased because people were more willing to donate. So by being customer centric, you can see this direct result of an improvement in income, which is pretty amazing. So that's just an example of an organisation that seems to have understood the need to be customer centric. What else can we do? We can be a little bit radical, I think, in our actual governance structure. Why wouldn't it be a good idea to potentially invite a customer, whoever your customer is, onto your board as a director? What about actually having policies drafted around your customers? What about maybe having a subcommittee? If you can't get your customers onto your board for whatever reason, creating a subcommittee of the board of these people who are receiving services from your organisation, so that they can then talk about the quality of the services and give direct feedback back up to the board. And I think this is where we're actually bringing the customers into the very heart of our governance structures. They're not just on the periphery, they're actually on our board, on a subcommittee, somehow involved at the very heart or the brain of the organisation. And I think it's so much easier then to know what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. This is an example of how that can work. So this was in the AHP Royal Commission report. Most of the examples were negative and bad. This is one of the few positive ones, where a lady, Miss Beverly Johnson, who was a resident at the facility, had been invited to join the Continuous Improvement Committee, which is a very positive name, as a resident representative. So she, at that committee, was able to raise, because she'd obviously talked to the other residents in the facility, she'd be able to raise complaints to them saying this has gone wrong and that's gone wrong, even something as simple as, you know, the quality of the food. The committee then took that on board. Wherever possible, it actually then did something about those particular issues. And she said that she felt respected and valued and could actually feel as if she was somehow contributing to the improvement of the services. So relatively easy, I think, to establish, but gives you that the board the direct link to the people, the customers who are the, you know, the actual people they want to serve. What else can we do? What can individual directors do, not just you know, as a collective group on the board? We can go on what's called customer safaris. Not actually wearing the 1970s safaris outfit, but actually being a little bit innovative in how a director can get that first-hand experience of what it's like to be a customer of the not-for-profit. Be a mystery shopper. Pretend to be a potential customer or client or purchaser of services, and actually see what that experience is like in calling up and making inquiries and emailing. Do you get an immediate response, or does it take 3 days to hear from anyone? And then doing the end-to-end customer journey. So take it all the way through to the end to see what it's like at every stage of the journey, identifying issues, and then as a director bring it back to the board and saying, I actually pretended to be a customer, and this is what I experienced, right? That's a good way of finding out what's going wrong. Trying to get regular feedback, being courageous enough to do surveys and talk to people and say what went wrong, what could we have done better, and then, you know, genuinely trying to do something about that. Or, which came out in the Aged Care Royal Commission, where directors actually spent a night at the facility. They actually ate the food, they slept in the beds, they engaged in the activities, and they saw firsthand what it was like. And I think for some of them would have been a real eye-opener. This is an example of a not-for-profit that tried to think outside the square in terms of improving its customer centricity, where they actually established a separate, they call it a council, but it's a committee, they called it the Community Advisory Council. And on that council, they brought in representatives from the different regions that they served, brought them all onto this council, and then actually brainstormed at that council level about the issues that those customers were experiencing, how could things be improved. And this was actually quite helpful during, when I say that, you know, COVID-19, we're still in COVID-19, but obviously Australia's doing quite well. Last year, in the thrust of it, this council was actually able to then give advice to the board about we're having issues with deliveries because of COVID, and so I was actually able to engage directly with the board and resolve a lot of the issues that the board may not have been aware of had they not actually had access to these people. So a very good idea that they're now going to continue with, and they're now even getting this council to get involved in the formulation of a strategy. And there's some of the tasks that you typically think a board would only do. The board is now actually even inviting this council to get involved in that, which I think is fantastic. And hopefully it wouldn't cost too much money, because I know not-for-profits have to think about that, but would really show their customers that they're taking their opinion seriously. So let's now move outside the organisation and start thinking about external stakeholders. So in the Banking Royal Commission, as I said, Commissioner Haynes said that the Director's duty of good faith must now include all stakeholders. So not the ones we immediately have any contact with, such as our employees and our customers. We need to think beyond that to all of the stakeholders. It's a widening, I think, of the duty. And they're calling it stakeholder governance. So this is possibly a brand new term. I haven't really heard of it myself before, but it must be an extension of what we normally think of as governance for a not-for-profit. It's now called stakeholder governance, which is where you're structuring your organisation and the way you make decisions to actually think about who these other stakeholders are and what they expect of you. So in this 2021 report about stakeholders, which came out a few days ago, it's worth reading. It says, if done well, stakeholder governance strengthens an organisation and will promote its long-term success. Poor stakeholder governance, by contrast, will typically increase the organisation's financial and non-financial risk profile and may precipitate major reputational damage. So, who are our external stakeholders? The AICD says it would be groups that have an interest in what your organisation is doing. For many charities, that's the government, other funders, corporate sponsors and the like. And it could include action groups that can be impacted by what you're doing, and those who actually have an impact on what you're doing. So people who have some sort of relationship with your organisation to the point that they're affecting you or you're affecting them. And what the AICD is saying is, even once you've actually defined who these people are, it's obviously good practice to review that every once in a while, because obviously things change. So we can't just assume our stakeholders today will be our stakeholders in 2 years' time. Here are some examples: third parties, contractors, suppliers, local communities, government authorities, regulators, human rights and advocacy groups, etc. Some of these may actually have some relevance to what your organisation is doing. So what can we do? How can we strategise to consider these other stakeholders and what their interests are? Firstly, we need to actually develop a framework that will help us systematically actually consider their interests. So it's not just this ad hoc, every once in a while we'll give some thought to what these people need from us, but actually having a system in place, be it on your agenda, your board agenda, or the way you actually, your strategy weekend, whatever it is, but somehow formally, periodically, having as a formal discussion, these are our stakeholders. Are we doing the right thing by them? Do we need to talk to them about any issues? and so on. We can actually then implement a system where we engage with these people. So that could be the board getting regular reports about these stakeholders and what their needs are. Again, subcommittees. You can do so much with subcommittees, because I know boards are limited in time and they can't talk about absolutely everything. But if you can then find the people to sit underneath the board at a subcommittee level where they can meet, 3 or 4 times a year, focus on their particular portfolio and then report back up to the board, I think it's an effective way of making sure that the board is hearing from these people without having to spend too much of its own time doing it. Something else the board can do is having regular meetings with stakeholders to get their perspective. But this engagement, the studies show this engagement with stakeholders has to be authentic. It's got to be sustained. You can't just do it the one time. It's got to be transparent, where you're willing to go back to your stakeholders afterwards and say, thank you for your meeting with us. Thank you for your feedback. We've talked about it, and this is what we're hoping to do. And also, obviously, being respectful towards them. The board can also make decisions taking these stakeholders' interests into account, which is obviously important. And they can do that by actually prioritising the interests of stakeholders. Now, for a not-for-profit or charity, mission is paramount, right? Your charitable purpose, your not-for-profit purpose, everything has got to somehow fold into that and support that. So the challenge for a board will be, when engaging with these external stakeholders, is saying to the stakeholder, we appreciate your concerns, we know what you need from us. We need to somehow see whether that fits in with our not-for-profit purpose, because if it doesn't, then we've got to think about how, whether we can do this or not. So any consideration by the board to change programs, to change activities, has always got to come back to that question: is it still fulfilling our purpose? If it isn't, then you've got to be a little bit more wary of it. And obviously then, when the board makes decisions concerning these stakeholders, if appropriate, to report back. So just to read that quote: directors do not have to agree with the views of stakeholders being put forward. It is not a black and white exercise. Directors need to simply inject themselves into the issues being raised and thoroughly consider and think them through. To cyber security. Obviously, it's becoming more and more important for every organisation, for-profit and not-for-profit, to be tech savvy and to appreciate that technology is critical to every aspect of the organisation. So it's not something we can just ignore and hope that it's all going to work out. So cyber attacks, we know, are on the increase, and we've got some statistics there. And they say that during the height of the pandemic in Australia last year, that increased because more and more people are working from home. So obviously a big issue that needs to be discussed at a board level. So the AICD is saying now that the duty of care and diligence, which is a standard duty that applies to directors, which leads to personal liability, now includes technology. Because technology is so critical to every aspect of the organisation, be it the payroll systems, engaging with customers, documents and the like, that the board now needs to be aware of that enough and on top of it enough, because if they don't, then it could be deemed to be a duty of care and diligence. So I haven't seen any court cases yet which have actually explored that. However, in August last year, I saw a bit of a movement toward that, where ASIC actually initiated proceedings against a company arguing that their failure to have and implement adequate cybersecurity measures was a contravention under the Corporations Act of their financial securities license, right? So you can see that the need to be on top of technology and adequately dealing with the potential for cyber attacks is weaving its way into duties under the Corporations Act. So there's a movement there that I think we need to be aware of, which again, it's got to put us on the alert. We can't keep ignoring this and hoping that management will take care of it and we don't need to concern ourselves. So what the AICD is saying is that this is now becoming so important at a board level, being aware of the technological systems in the organisation and how prepared we are for cyber attacks, that the fact that a director doesn't have specialist IT experience or knowledge or understand anything much about cybersecurity is not an excuse. So I think, and I saw this happen many years ago when a particular case, the Centro case, when judgment was handed down, where the judge said, at a board level, financial responsibility is non-delegable, right? So I know you've got CFOs, and I know you've got audit finance committees, and I know you've got accounting firms advising you, but at the end of the day, the buck stops with the board, and each director has to take equal responsibility for the financial metrics of the organisation. If you don't know how to read a balance sheet, if you don't know how to read a profit and loss statement, go off and get educated, right? And that afternoon, I was sent off on a course on the boards I sat on. Vera, go and educate yourself about the finances of the organisation. The fact, if I, following that, still didn't understand, that would be my fault, right? So here we're seeing that there's a movement towards the position where a director needs to have some understanding of how it works. They don't need to have a particular level of expertise, but they still need to be interested in, aware of it, across it, and be alert enough to say, if I don't understand this well enough, please have someone explain it to me. So when I see and read the reports at a board level about our IT systems and cybersecurity, I actually understand enough to be able to ask questions and get some sense of assurance that, you know, we're doing what we should be doing. It's moving to the point where it's being said that because information and computer technology is so critical, the failure of properly overseeing that aspect of it can lead to breach of the director's duties, particularly if the directors have not maintained what's called a security policy. Now, this is, I have to admit, a little bit new to me as well. I have seen in recent times not-for-profits implementing what they call an information policy, where they're recording in a document the need to protect information, where they're going to have it stored, how they're going to make sure that it cannot be accessed by the wrong people in the organisation. So I've seen that this seems to be the next step, where it's being encouraged for an organisation to have a security policy, which I'm imagining goes through what the security measures are, what frameworks they've got in place, who their external advisors are, and the like. So the AICD report is saying that it could be a breach of directors' duties if you don't have a security policy, which is, I think, quite a radical statement. I don't know whether I necessarily agree with that, but I think that what they're trying to convey is that especially the board of the organisation needs to have a good handle on what the systems are and how they work and what protections they've got in place to make sure that any cyber attack isn't successful. So what should directors do? Number one, as I've said, inform themselves about the technological systems in the organisation, cybersecurity, privacy, data storage, those sort of basic things. I would have thought when a director joins a board, as part of the induction pack, that should be explained so they understand how that particular organisation works. Secondly, ensure governance structures are in place, such as policies having appropriate, if you can afford it, appropriate personnel dedicated to IT. Before you all get scared and think, oh my gosh, this is all too much, and we can't afford to do that, we're too small, or we don't understand enough. The AICD has said it probably will be a defence to the duty of care and diligence if the board can show that despite the fact that some sort of attack happened or some sort of loss or damage, nevertheless the board was aware of, was alert enough to know that that risk was possible, and they did everything they could, they had the frameworks in place to try to protect from that attack. So the actual fact that the attack happened does not necessarily mean that the directors are personally liable if they could show that they did what they could to try to prevent that from happening. So this then begs the question to me, well, many not-for-profits are too small, they can't afford IT personnel, they can't afford fancy complex software to protect from cyber attacks. And this always encourages me when I read this, because I think it's a sign that courts do understand that not every organisation is the same, and we need to be able to work within the resources that we've got. So what they're saying is that the standard of care that's required in the duty of care and diligence about technology depends on the organisation's circumstances. So if you're a small not-for-profit and you just don't have the money to do this, that will be taken into account if something were to occur. So the courts will look at the nature of the activities that you're running, your size, the level of engagement that directors have in the business. So this is the extent to which the directors are non-executive that come in once every couple of months, and that's their only contact, versus those who are actually involved in the day-to-day operations. The courts will look at the distribution of work between board and management and the actual knowledge and expertise of the directors. The court will actually acknowledge that if you're a small organisation, you've got a small board, it's going to be highly unlikely at a board level you're going to have the technology expertise that you want. So that is taken into account. So I think the any board of a not-for-profit has to, within its finances, within its resources, think about what is the best that we can do to be able to tick off on complying with this duty by doing the best we can to have the policies in place and the protection in place to, you know, protect us from any sort of cyber attack, which is encouraging because not everyone can afford a whole IT department or, you know, fancy software. So in addition to this new concept of stakeholder governance, we also have IT governance. Again, something fairly recent. And another expansion of what we normally think about as being governance. So IT governance is a system by which the current and future use of IT is directed and controlled. Corporate governance of IT involves evaluating and directing the use of IT to support the organisation and monitoring this use to achieve plans. It includes the strategy, magical word today, strategy, and policies for using IT within an organisation. So what sort of strategies can we implement? Again, based on the size and the resources of your organisation. So firstly, does the board understand the vulnerability of the organisation to cyber attack and the consequences of what could happen? 2, what level of risk is the board willing to accept? Every board will have its own risk appetite, right? So what risk can we live with? What risk can we not live with? 3, does the board need to allocate more resources to it? And fourthly, this is again a continuous monitoring exercise. You can't just sort of form a position on risk in 2021 and then not look at it for another 3 years. It should be part of your risk management framework where the board at least 2 or 3 times a year has a look at it and say, is this still appropriate? You know, do we need to change anything? The IT governance framework should include an evaluation of your current cybersecurity profile, identify the profile that you want to have, what needs to change to achieve that, assess progress, and again, communicate with stakeholders. And if you can, if this is something that's available to you, then ideally have a director with IT expertise on the board. If not, have a subcommittee or someone with expertise on the subcommittee, or if nothing else, at least have a contract with someone external to the organisation who can provide you with the expertise that you need. Finally, climate change. So again, something we know is of increasing relevance and importance to society. There have been 2 different types of risk associated with climate change. One's transition risk and one's physical risk. Transition risk is the risk of moving to a lower carbon economy, so that includes policies, market changes, etc. Physical risk is the risk of something actually happening in the environment, such as the bushfires that we experienced last year. So the authorities say that when you're developing strategy at a board level, you have to pay particular attention to your transition risks, right? If we do not have policies in place, if we do not think about how our organisation will impact on the environment longer term, then that is in particular a risk to the directors. What other risks do we face? Reputational risk from changing consumer behaviour and expectations, loss of corporate customers who demand action on climate change, having stranded assets, which means having to write down the value of assets that have a high carbon intensity, having products made obsolete. These are all risks. Threat of technological change, the need to adapt, and then obviously the financial impact on assets from events such as flooding, bushfires and the like. So Noel Hutley, Senior Counsel, wrote a fantastic paper about this. He looked at the connection between climate change and directors' duties, which I found quite interesting. And he said, the impact of climate change is now seen as a foreseeable risk by the courts. We can no longer put our heads in the sand and say this is not an issue, right? We all know it's a risk. So he says it is a necessary risk that directors must, not can, must consider when putting together a strategy and making decisions. And these risks are, as I said, physical and transition. He also mentions litigation risk, which he calls a tertiary risk. So this is the risk that your organisation will be sued because you haven't properly thought about the impact that your organisation is having on the community, the environment, and the like. And what I'm seeing here is another trend that I sort of came across when I was looking at the effects of COVID-19. Prior to COVID-19, many contracts would have what's called a force majeure clause. And that clause says, effectively, if something happens beyond the control of a party, then that party is generally absolved from having to comply with their obligations for so long as this event is happening. And then once the event is resolved, you sort of resume, right? Now, COVID-19 happened in February, March last year. And suddenly this was a very important clause because, amongst other things, not-for-profits had booked in hotels for conferences and venues and various other things. And because of government restrictions, a lot of that had to be cancelled. And so those clauses in particular became very important. Was it the case that because of government restrictions, the not-for-profits still had to go and pay the hotel fee for a venue they couldn't have? Or was it the case that not-for-profit could say, we actually can't hold this event, it's illegal for us to do so, so therefore it's not a breach on our part to not actually go ahead with the event? Can we negotiate, a postponed date? After the intensity of COVID started to subside, we then saw as lawyers that in drafting new contracts and using the force majeure clause, suddenly there was discussion, should that include a pandemic or not? And there was a school of thought that said, well, we now know what a pandemic looks like. We know what consequence and effect it can have on us. So therefore, it is now foreseeable risk. People talking about COVID-20, COVID-21. So therefore, you can't hide behind the force majeure clause anymore because it's foreseeable. And so therefore, you should have already put into place systems and frameworks to deal with another pandemic, right? And I'm seeing the same thing happen here. We know what can happen with bushfires and flooding. A lot of people went through it firsthand. So as organisations, we can no longer say, oh, we can't foresee that, we can't expect that, we can't be prepared for that. The law is starting to say, well, actually, you've seen it. You know it can happen. You can't ignore it. And so therefore, the way you should be running your organisation, making these decisions at a board level, needs to be in the context of these events can happen. And if they were to happen, how prepared are we to be able to continue to operate regardless? So I'm seeing a bit of a trend where the law is saying, once you've been through something, it then becomes almost foreseeable. So therefore, you can't then not be prepared anymore. You've actually got to be prepared enough to deal with similar events in the future. So Noel Hutley said, climate change is a big problem worldwide, in particular for Australia, obviously with the bushfires. And he foresees an increase in litigation against directors personally because they fail to plan for, prepare and mitigate against the effects of climate change. And this is supported by the fact that I think the community is expecting more of us in terms of being on top of climate change issues, and even regulators such as ASIC. And so then the conclusion of that is, if we as directors fail to consider climate change when making decisions, that could be a breach of our duty of care and diligence. So ASIC, one of our main regulators, agrees with Noel Hutley's opinion, and the Commissioner John Price said that with the duty of care and diligence, there's what's called the business judgment rule. So that's a rule that says If the board made a decision which was subsequently discovered to be a bad decision, and they get, the board gets sued, if the board can show that at the time of making the decision, they did their homework, they talked to the right people, they collected the right information, and they did basically whatever they could to make the best decision they could, but nevertheless the decision ended up being a bad one, that's usually a defence, right? What ASIC is saying is they do not think you can use that defence in a breach of the duty of care and diligence when it comes to climate change, which is quite a startling position. It goes on to say, directors need to understand and continually reassess existing and emerging risks that may be applicable to their business and ask the relevant questions of management. So this is even going beyond climate change. This should extend to both short-term and long-term risks and opportunities. Now, we haven't yet seen any cases which have discussed the issue of climate change, is that a risk that needs to be considered by directors? But again, you can see there's a shift, there's a movement there, where if that were to occur, I wouldn't be surprised if the directors were held responsible. In addition to that, I think from the prospect of climate change, not-for-profit organisations need to be, many of them are, but need to be aware of how does the organisation's failure to take climate change seriously affect their relationship with their customers, potential clients and the like. So especially with younger people. So in a 2019 study by Amnesty International of over 10,000 18 to 25-year-olds across 22 countries, 41% believed that climate change is the most important issue facing the world. So what we're saying here is if a not-for-profit doesn't tap into that concern and show the wider community that they are also concerned and they're doing their part to deal with it, they may be disenfranchising themselves from that younger market, which for many not-for-profits is a real struggle anyway, because they're sort of struggling to connect with the younger people. So by ignoring what's of most concern to younger people, that could then be adding to their problem. Here's a case study of Patagonia, which is a social enterprise dealing with fashion. What they did was they sat down, they said, let's think about all our stakeholders, our employees, the broader community, build it into our strategy and decide for ourselves what is most important to us. And they decided that the main concern for them was climate change. So they then instigated all these initiatives, which I've got there up on the screen. And they found that by implementing these initiatives and showing the community that they were genuinely concerned about climate change and doing their part to address that, they tripled their profits in a period of 7 years. So obviously they're tapping into a market that's got that same concern as them, which has led to their success. So what do we conclude about climate change? Firstly, it goes without saying the community is expecting organisations, especially not-for-profits. I think there's some greater expectation on us, especially not-for-profits, to be proactive about climate change. What does that mean? It's got to be part of our strategy. It's got to be something that's discussed at a board level. And if it is part of our strategy, then it is more likely that directors will be complying with their duties of good faith and care and diligence. And if directors are dealing with it as part of their strategy, it will inevitably result in a greater attraction to the organisation of clients, customers, donations, etc., because they're resonating with a concern that the wider community has. So, takeaways. My first takeaway is please don't all resign. I don't want you to think this is all too hard and I'm now going to, resign from being a director or resign from the organisation. No, I think this is just a call to arms. This is a challenge for us to think about how we can improve our governance and start thinking beyond what we normally thought of as governance to these other stakeholders and these other concerns. Governance is widening. You will have seen that, right? We've now got IT governance, stakeholder governance. So we need to be a little bit more open to what governance actually includes, and then obviously incorporate that into our systems, our structures, our board structures, subcommittees, policies, culture, etc. And I think what we can also learn from this, whatever action you decide to take, it's got to be systematic, it's got to be genuine, and I think as people sitting on a board or a senior management, we have got to be alert to what's happening, right? We need to see what's happening at a community level. We need to see what's concerning the community. We need to see what's happening in the environment and not ignore that and say that's what you have, that's not our responsibility. But to the extent that it is something you can do something about, build that into your strategy so that you can hand on heart say, we've thought about all of our stakeholders, we've thought about what's happening in our community, and to the extent that we can within our mission, we have built that into our strategy, we're taking it seriously, we're talking about it, we're acting on it. And I think if we do that, then it's more likely that directors will be fulfilling their duties and more likely that we'll be successful in achieving our mission. So I'm going to end there, and we've got a few minutes for questions. So if anyone in the room or online has any questions, I'm happy to take them. You're all too scared now, aren't you? Yes. All right, Stephen.
My question goes back to the culture of the board regarding the ideas of IT governance or climate change governance or those sort of things. The world hasn't changed in terms of privacy or contract signing or anything else. The concept is still the same. As a director, you need to know where this thing is stored, how it's kept secure, what technologies used has changed. Isn't the real problem where you started? That boards typically are made up of people not working anymore in the not-for-profit space, who are volunteering their time and aren't current with that.
Yeah.
So the culture of how we form a board and how we get to that group in that room and how we renew that is probably the crux of the issue, because emerging issues like IT or climate change can be solved by people who have more of a hand on the pulse. So if your board doesn't have a younger generation and a renewal strategy, is that a bigger problem than not having an IT strategy or a climate change or in aged care customer service strategy?
I think not having the right people sitting around the board table is the genesis of so many of these issues, which is why at the very beginning I started with you've got to have the right composition. Now, I know that many not-for-profits will say to me, well, Vera, that's just too hard, right? We don't have access to those sorts of people. We can't attract the right people, or our constitution doesn't allow us to bring in the right people. And this is obviously where you've got to start. You've got to have a strategy even about how you're going to change your board so you can then tackle all these other issues. But I think even if you've got a group of people sitting around a board table and they're not savvy about IT, or they're not interested, or they just don't have that mental ability to be able to put their arms around all these different issues that I've spoken about, this is possibly where management could, in preparing the agenda, put together some information that they take to the board and they say, we know you're all busy, we know you only turn up for 2 hours, or you wouldn't say that, would be a little bit rude, but we know you only turn up every 2 hours every third month, but we want to bring to your attention how our IT system works. We want to bring to your attention these other issues and try to weave it into the discussion so that the board is almost forced to at least have some understanding of what these issues are. Yeah. John?
Hi, Vera. Some of the comments I was surprised at was the idea of a director going and doing some research into as a secret customer or things like that. And if I was the CEO of an organisation, I would be horrified if one of my directors was doing that. I think a lot of this, you mentioned, you so much talk about directors, but a lot of this comes down to management. If you've got good management, they will get the board that they need, and they will do a lot of these things. So, and the other observation I have is that the discussion of stakeholder, all of the stakeholders. Fair enough, you've got to always consider what the interests of the right groups are, but as you said as well, that I think it's paramount that make sure you've got a nice clear mission of your organisation. Yes. If you've got a clear purpose, that's what you should be judging it on all the time. It shouldn't be that you should be thinking that we've got to help a variety of stakeholders when that's, I don't think.
Yeah, you always got to have a filter, right? And so you're talking to these stakeholders and you're collecting from them their concerns, their issues, their expectations of you. Then you put it through the filter of, but what is our mission, right? Because otherwise it's very easy to then veer off into a direction that takes you away from what you're supposed to do. It's called mission drift, right? And suddenly you are pandering to the expectations of these people, but not actually then fulfilling what you're set up to do. So it's that balancing act of, yes, we want to talk to you, want to understand what you require of us, but let us not forget our main purpose is to do X, Y, Z, and we've still got to be able to prove to everyone, including the ACNC or the tax office, this is actually what we're doing. Any online? No, everyone's quiet. Okay. Any other questions or comments?
How often do you think we should review strats?
I think most and John, you may want to comment. I think most organisations will do a formal strategy, say every 3 years, 2 or 3 years. But I like those organisations that nevertheless every year will sit down and review it, because 3 years is a long time. Is it still working for us? Do we need to tweak it because something's happened, so we've got to sort of change it slightly?
Vera, I'd suggest I don't like the idea of 3-year plans myself, because if we had set our plan in 2019, well, things changed.
Yeah.
And I think that surely every board should have 1 day a year where it looks at its plan and says, well, this is the plan. So I fear that there's a laziness if you say a 3-year or a 5-year plan, that the 2 years in the middle or 4 years in the middle, you're saying, oh, we've got a plan, we don't have to worry about it. So I'm strongly in favour of annual strategic plan, but I'd also say that don't rethink them all the time unless there's a crisis. Obviously, all the associations, I work with associations, and they change their strategic plans because of COVID. But normally, you don't have to keep going back and doing that quite so often. But it's very motivating for a board to have a good planning day, and we call them planning days more than strategy days, by the way.
And what I really like, you can see that I need a life, right? Because I get excited about these things. What I really like is when I see board agendas with recommendations for decisions to be made, but in the discussion of that particular matter being discussed, it quotes the relevant part of the strategy that touches upon that. So in every decision that the board is being asked to consider, oh, okay, yes, this is really to further clause 4 of our strategy plan, which is to do, A, B, C. So there's this constant tying back to our strategy. And so it's always front and centre of mind when the directors are actually deciding what they're going to do. All right. Okay, so thank you for joining me. We will send out the PowerPoints, and I've also put together a short summary as a separate little resource, which then summarises all of the practical recommendations that I went through this morning. You may be able to use it as a starting guide for any sort of change you want to implement. If you think of any questions later on, by all means email me. But thank you for listening, and I hope that you learned something new this morning. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Vera.